We are taught that the Oval Office is reserved for the sharpest minds in history. That is a lie. The reality is a chaotic collection of men who have lost fights to swamp rabbits, gambled away government property, and nearly started nuclear wars because of a bad joke. We are peeling back the curtain to show you the clumsy, bizarre, and downright stupid truth behind the power. Here are 33 times the American presidency was a total train wreck. 1. William Howard Taft and the bathtub. Let us start with a heavy hitter, literally. William Howard Taft was a big guy, weighing over 300 pounds, and while size does not usually matter in politics, it definitely matters in plumbing. The story goes that shortly after his inauguration, Taft decided to take a relaxing bath in the White House. The problem was that the tub was standard size, and Taft was not. He became physically wedged inside the porcelain vessel. It was not just a tight squeeze, he was properly stuck. His staff actually had to use butter to grease him up and slide the leader of the free world out like a cork from a bottle. After this slippery humiliation, Taft did not take any chances. He commissioned a custom bathtub so massive that 4 grown men could sit in it comfortably. There is even a famous photo of 4 workers sitting in his new tub just to prove a point. 2. George H.W. Bush and the Japanese Prime Minister. Diplomacy is a delicate art involving handshakes, treaties, and preferably keeping your dinner inside your stomach. In 1992, President Bush failed the last part of that test during a state banquet in Japan. He was seated next to Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa when a sudden bout of acute gastroenteritis hit him like a freight train. Bush fainted and famously vomited directly into the lap of the Japanese Prime Minister. It was a diplomatic nightmare caught on tape for the world to see. The incident was so culturally shocking and specific that the Japanese language actually adopted a new slang term for vomiting in public. They called it bushusuru, which literally translates to doing a bush. You know you have messed up when your name becomes a verb for throwing up on world leaders. 3. Andrew Jackson and the cursing parrot. Andrew Jackson was known as a tough, gritty man who loved duels and fighting, and apparently, he took his work home with him. He had a pet African gray parrot named Pole, and because parrots are like tape recorders with feathers, Paul learned everything Jackson said. When Jackson died in 1845, thousands gathered for his solemn funeral to pay their respects. The mood was somber until Paul started screaming a stream of profanity so vile and loud that it shocked the mourners. The bird was unleashing a greatest hits collection of the president's worst swear words right there in the church. The funeral attendants had to physically remove the bird from the ceremony because it would not stop cursing at the guests. It is honestly the most Andrew Jackson way to leave a funeral. 4. William Henry Harrison and the longest speech. This is a tragic lesson in why you should listen to your mother when she tells you to wear a coat. William Henry Harrison wanted to prove he was a tough military hero and not just some old man. So, on his inauguration day in 1841, he decided to give the longest speech in history. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, delivering over 8,000 words in the freezing cold rain without a coat or a hat. He thought it made him look strong, but biology disagreed. He caught a cold that turned into pneumonia, and he died just 30 days later. He holds the record for the longest inaugural address and the shortest presidency, all because he was too stubborn to put on a jacket. It is basically the ultimate example of toxic masculinity backfiring in the worst possible way. 5. Joe Biden and the teleprompter. We have all had moments where we go on autopilot, but when you are the president, the cameras are always rolling. During a speech about executive orders, Joe Biden fell victim to the classic Ron Burgundy blunder. He was reading from a teleprompter that included technical instructions for the speaker, usually written in brackets or different colors. Instead of pausing, Biden read the instructions out loud as part of the sentence. He confidently said, "End of quote." Repeat the line. It was a bizarre peek behind the curtain of political theater. It made everyone pause and wonder how much of modern politics is just reading lines off a screen. It was not a policy disaster, but it was a meme-worthy moment that proved even the most experienced politicians are just one technical glitch away from sounding like a robot. 6. John Quincy Adams and the Mole People. John Quincy Adams is usually remembered as a serious intellectual with a high IQ, which makes this failure even more baffling. He was a huge supporter of the hollow earth theory. This was the belief that the earth is not solid, but is actually hollow and habitable on the inside, possibly filled with mole people or lost civilizations. Adams did not just read about it for fun. He actively approved a federal expedition to travel to the Arctic Circle to find the entrance to the inner earth. He wanted to establish trade relations with the underground mole people. Fortunately, by the time the expedition was fully planned, Andrew Jackson took office and canceled the funding, realizing that hunting for mole people was probably a waste of taxpayer money. 7. Zachary Taylor and the Cherries with Milk. Zachary Taylor was a war hero known as Old Rough and Ready. He survived bullets, cannon fire, and brutal military campaigns, but he could not survive a snack. On the 4th of July in 1850, Taylor attended a celebration under the hot Washington sun. To cool down, he consumed a massive amount of raw cherries and washed them down with iced milk. This gastrointestinal cocktail wreaked havoc on his stomach. Doctors at the time diagnosed him with cholera morbus, which is basically a fancy way of saying his gut exploded. He died 5 days later. It is one of the most anticlimactic deaths in history. Imagine surviving wars only to be taken out by a bowl of fruit and some dairy. It is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is your own lunch. 8. Ulysses S. Grant and the speeding ticket. Before there were muscle cars and street racers, there was Ulysses S. Grant on a horse. Grant loved speed, and he had a habit of racing his horse-drawn carriage through the streets of Washington, D.C., like a maniac. It got so bad that a police officer actually pulled him over. The officer was terrified when he realized he had just stopped the President of the United States, but Grant, to his credit, admitted he was speeding. The officer arrested the sitting president and fined him $20, which was a lot of money back then. Grant had to walk back to the White House on foot. He remains the only president to be arrested for speeding while in office. It turns out he was the original furious driver, long before Hollywood made movies about it. 9. Bill Clinton and the $200 haircut. We have all had bad hair days, but Bill Clinton had a bad hair day that ruined the travel plans of thousands of people. In 1993, Clinton was sitting aboard Air Force One at Los Angeles International Airport, waiting for a haircut from a famous stylist named Christoph. The problem was that while the president was getting his hair trimmed, Air Force One remained on the tarmac with its engines running. For nearly an hour, 2 of the busiest runways at LAX were completely shut down for security reasons. Commercial flights were forced to circle in the air, burning fuel and patience, while regular people missed connections in business meetings. It became known as Hairgate. All of that chaos just so the president could look fresh for the cameras. It remains the most expensive and disruptive trim in aviation history. 10. Andrew Johnson and the drunken inauguration. Most people get nervous before starting a new job, but Andrew Johnson decided to handle his nerves with a bottle of whiskey. On the morning of his inauguration as vice president in 1865, Johnson was feeling ill, allegedly from typhoid fever, so he drank 3 stiff glasses of whiskey to steady himself. By the time he walked into the Senate chamber, he was completely hammered. He delivered a rambling, incoherent speech where he slurred his words, bragged about his humble origins, and openly insulted cabinet members sitting right in front of him. Abraham Lincoln looked on in absolute horror, burying his face in his hands. Johnson eventually had to be pulled away from the podium. It was such a disaster that he went into hiding for weeks to escape the shame. 11. Ronald Reagan and the bombing of Russia. Microphones are dangerous weapons in the hands of a joker, and Ronald Reagan learned this the hard way. During a sound check for a weekly radio address in 1984, Reagan thought he was speaking only to the technicians in the room. He decided to test the mic with a joke, saying, "My fellow Americans, I am pleased to tell you today that I have signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." He thought it was hilarious. The problem was that the recording leaked. While Americans realized it was a joke, The Soviet Union did not find it funny at all. The Soviet army was briefly placed on high alert, bringing the world terrifyingly close to nuclear conflict, just because the president wanted to practice his stand-up comedy routine. 12. Gerald Ford and the tamale. Gerald Ford had a reputation for being clumsy, but his biggest fail was culinary. While campaigning in San Antonio, Texas, he was offered a plate of fresh tamales out of the Alamo. This is a staple food in Texas, but Ford, being from Michigan, had apparently never seen one before. Instead of unwrapping the corn husk like a normal human, he bit directly into it. He tried to chew through the tough, inedible husk while cameras flashed and the local hosts watched in stunned silence. It was like watching someone try to eat a banana without peeling it first. The incident became a symbol of how out of touch he was with regular voters and different cultures. He survived the husk, but his dignity took a massive hit that day. 13. Warren Harding and the Lost China. Warren G. Harding is often ranked as one of the worst presidents, and his gambling habits certainly did not help. He was obsessed with poker and hosted twice-weekly games at the White House where the booze flowed freely, despite prohibition. He was not just playing for chips, he was playing with government property. During one particularly intense hand of poker, Harding ran out of money but refused to fold. He wagered a priceless set of White House china that dated back to the presidency of Benjamin Harrison. He lost the hand to Louise Cromwell Brooks. Just like that, a piece of American history was packed up in a crate and shipped out the door because the president did not know when to fold them. 14. Richard Nixon and the talking portraits. The end of the Nixon presidency was like a dark psychological thriller. As the Watergate scandal closed in around him and impeachment became inevitable, Nixon began to unravel. Reports from White House staff and Secret Service agents described a president who was drinking heavily and suffering from severe insomnia. In the middle of the night, he would wander the empty halls of the White House, stopping to have full-blown arguments with the oil portraits of former presidents on the walls. He was reportedly seen yelling at Washington and Jefferson, asking them for advice or justifying his actions. It paints a haunting picture of a powerful man completely alone, losing his grip on reality while the ghosts of history stared back at him in silence. 15. Andrew Jackson and the Big Cheese. In 1835, a dairy farmer decided to give Andrew Jackson a truly massive gift. It was a block of cheddar cheese weighing 1,400 pounds. Jackson, not knowing what to do with a wheel of cheese the size of a car, left it in the White House entrance hall for 2 years. It aged and it smelled. The odor was reportedly so strong it made people's eyes water. Finally, to get rid of it, Jackson invited the public to come and eat it. 10,000 people showed up and devoured the entire block in 2 hours. While the cheese was gone, the greasy stains and the horrific smell soaked into the carpets and curtains, plaguing the White House for years. It gives a whole new meaning to the term the Big Cheese. 16. Jimmy Carter and the nuclear codes. The codes to launch a nuclear strike are supposed to be the most guarded secret on the planet, kept on a card affectionately known as the biscuit. You would expect this card to be in a titanium vault or handcuffed to a general. However, legend has it that Jimmy Carter once simply forgot the biscuit in the pocket of his suit. The suit was then sent to the dry cleaners. Imagine the shock of a minimum wage laundry worker reaching into a pocket to check for loose change and pulling out the power to destroy civilization. It was never officially confirmed for obvious security reasons, but the story persists as the ultimate example of a security breach. It turns out the biggest threat to national security wasn't the Soviet Union, but a gentle cycle wash. 17. Benjamin Harrison and the fear of light. When electricity was first installed in the White House in 1891, it was considered a terrifying magical force rather than a convenience. President Benjamin Harrison and his wife Caroline were absolutely convinced that the electrical current was constantly leaking out of the sockets like invisible gas. They were petrified that if they touched the switches, they would be instantly electrocuted and die on the spot. As a result, the President of the United States refused to touch any light switch in his own home. They would often sleep with the bright lights blazing all night long because they were too scared to turn them off. or they would force the servants to act as human shields and flip the switches for them. It is a hilarious image to imagine the most powerful man in the country paralyzed by a plastic button. 18. Harry Truman and the music critic. Presidents are supposed to have thick skin, but Harry Truman had zero chill when it came to his daughter Margaret. After she gave a singing performance that was panned by critics, Washington Post writer Paul Hume wrote a brutal review saying she was flat and off-key. Instead of ignoring it like a professional, Truman sat down and wrote a violent, threatening letter on official White House stationery. He told the critic he sounded like a frustrated old man and famously threatened him by saying, "You will need a new nose and plenty of beefsteak for black eyes." The letter was leaked to the press, and the public was absolutely shocked to see the leader of the free world acting like an angry internet commenter, threatening to beat someone up over a bad review of his kid. 19. James Madison and the burning of Washington. James Madison might be the father of the Constitution, but as a wartime leader, he was a total disaster during the War of 1812. When British troops marched on Washington, D.C., Madison fled the city in a chaotic panic to avoid being captured. He left in such a hurry that he left a fully cooked dinner on the table at the White House. When the British officers entered the building, they found the table set with wine and food, still warm. They sat down, ate the president's dinner, drank his wine to toast his defeat, and then proceeded to set the building on fire. His wife, Dolly Madison, became the real hero of the day for staying behind to save the portrait of George Washington while James was busy running for the hills. 20. Andrew Jackson and the inauguration riot. If you think modern college parties get out of hand, you have never seen the inauguration of 1829. Andrew Jackson campaigned as a man of the people, so he invited the entire public to the White House to celebrate his victory. It was a massive mistake. Thousands of rough frontiersmen showed up in muddy boots, climbing on the delicate furniture to get a look at the president. They smashed thousands of dollars worth of china and glass in a drunken frenzy. The crowd was so crushing that Jackson was pressed against a wall and had to escape through a window to avoid being suffocated by his own fans. The staff only managed to clear the building by placing giant tubs of whiskey punch on the front lawn, proving that free alcohol is the only way to hurt a mob. 21. Herbert Hoover and Hoover Ball. Herbert Hoover was not known for being a fun guy, but his morning exercise routine was objectively bizarre. His personal physician invented a game called Hoover Ball to keep the president fit. It was played with a 6-pound medicine ball over a high volleyball net. Imagine tennis, but instead of a light ball, you are hurling a heavy leather sack that could knock the wind out of a horse. Hoover forced his cabinet members, men in their 50s and 60s, to play this grueling game every single morning at 7 o'clock. Passers-by would stop and stare at the sad sight of government officials in white trousers struggling to throw a heavy ball at each other. It was less of a sport and more of a torture method disguised as leisure, and it thankfully died the moment he left office. 22. John F. Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs. This operation is the definition of a military fiasco. In 1961, JFK authorized a CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro using a group of Cuban exiles. The plan relied entirely on the element of surprise and local air support. However, Kennedy got cold feet at the last minute and canceled the crucial airstrikes to hide American involvement, leaving the invasion force completely exposed on the beach. They were pinned down like sitting ducks. The invaders were killed or captured within 3 days, and the United States looked incredibly incompetent on the world stage. Kennedy had to go on national television and accept full responsibility for the mess. It was a rookie mistake that humiliatingly backfired and actually strengthened Castro's grip on power for decades to come. 23. Ronald Reagan and the astrologer. It is terrifying to realize that during the height of the Cold War, the president's schedule was being dictated by the alignment of the stars. After the assassination attempt on Reagan, First Lady Nancy Reagan became obsessed with astrology and hired a woman named Joan Quigley to consult on everything. Quigley used charts to determine color-coded days for the president. Green days were good for decisions, and red days were bad. This astrologer influenced when Air Force One took off, when the president gave speeches, and even the timing of nuclear summits with Mikhail Gorbachev. The White House chief of staff was constantly frustrated because he could not schedule important meetings if the moon was in the wrong house. For years, the most powerful office on Earth was secretly run according to the daily horoscope. 24. Thomas Jefferson and the Outlived. Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant writer, but his Embargo Act of 1807 was a spectacular economic suicide. In an attempt to punish Britain and France without going to war, he decided to stop all international trade. He thought Europe needed American goods so badly they would beg for mercy. He was wrong. They just traded with other people, while the American economy completely collapsed. Ports shut down, ships rotted at the docks, and unemployment skyrocketed. People hated the act so much they started calling it the Outlived Act, which is embargo spelled backwards, because the government was grabbing their money. Jefferson left office leaving the economy in absolute ruins, proving that you can write the Declaration of Independence and still be terrible at basic economics. 25. Millard Fillmore and the boring compliment. Millard Fillmore is the patron saint of being completely forgettable. He was so uninspiring and politically ineffective that most history books skip him entirely. The most famous story about him serves as the ultimate backhanded compliment. When he met Queen Victoria, she famously called him the most handsome man she had ever seen. While that sounds flattering, historians agree it was likely because there was absolutely nothing else to say about the man. He had no major achievements, no charisma, and no defining policy. Being called pretty by a foreign monarch was the highlight of his career because his actual presidency was a void of mediocrity. He was the human equivalent of a beige wall, proving that sometimes the biggest failure in history is simply being too boring to remember. 26. Harry Truman and the haberdashery. Before he was the commander-in-chief deciding the fate of the free world, Harry Truman was the commander of terrible business decisions. In the early 1920s, Truman opened a high-end men's clothing store, known as a haberdashery, in downtown Kansas City. He poured his life savings into selling silk shirts and fancy hats to farmers. Unfortunately, the economy crashed in 1921, and the store went belly up almost immediately. Truman was not just broke, he was drowning in crippling debt that took him nearly 15 years to pay off. It is absolutely wild to think that the man who would later reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of the 20th century spent his 30s stressed out because he could not sell enough overpriced hats during a recession. 27. Woodrow Wilson and the Spanish flu. Woodrow Wilson is the guy who tried to ghost a global pandemic. When the Spanish flu broke out in 1918, killing millions of people, Wilson famously refused to acknowledge it publicly. He did not want to hurt morale during World War I, so he suppressed news about the virus, allowing it to spread unchecked. Karma eventually caught up with him during the peace negotiations in Paris. Wilson contracted the flu himself and became delirious with a high fever. Historians believe his illness made him weak, paranoid, and disoriented, causing him to cave to the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty humiliated Germany and arguably set the stage for World War II, meaning his failure to handle a virus might have helped cause the next global war. 28. James Buchanan and the Civil War. James Buchanan is consistently ranked as the absolute worst president in history, and he earned that title by doing absolutely nothing. As the southern states began to secede from the Union, signaling the start of the Civil War, Buchanan literally sat at his desk and watched the country fall apart. His official legal stance was that while seceding was illegal, the Constitution did not give him the power to stop it. He was like a firefighter watching a house burn down and saying he was not allowed to turn on the hose. He spent his final months paralyzed by indecision, desperate to leave office so he could dump the flaming wreckage of the nation onto Abraham Lincoln's lap. It was the ultimate act of cowardly procrastination. 29. Theodore Roosevelt and the River of Doubt. Teddy Roosevelt was the ultimate tough guy, but his post-presidency midlife crisis almost killed him. After losing the election of 1912, he decided to explore an uncharted river in the Amazon basin called the River of Doubt. It turned into a suicide mission. The expedition was a disaster from the start. Roosevelt contracted a nasty tropical fever and cut his leg, which became severely infected. He lost 50 pounds and was so delirious with pain that he begged his son to leave him behind to die in the jungle so he would not slow the group down. He survived, but he was never the same physically. It turns out that fighting nature in the Amazon is a lot harder than fighting politicians in Washington. 30. John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts. John Adams was a founding father who helped write the Constitution, which makes it super awkward that he was the first one to violate it. In 1798, he signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which effectively made it a crime to criticize the federal government. Yes, the guy who fought a revolution for freedom banned free speech because his feelings were hurt by bad press. Dozens of newspaper editors were arrested and thrown in jail just for mocking him. It was a massive overreach of power that made him incredibly unpopular. The American people hated it so much that they voted him out of office after just one term, proving that you cannot just outlaw your haters and expect to get away with it. 31. Herbert Hoover and the Bonus Army. Herbert Hoover virtually guaranteed his election loss with one single, horrific decision involving American war heroes. In 1932, thousands of World War I veterans marched on Washington to demand early payment of their service bonuses to survive the Great Depression. They set up a shantytown near the Capitol. Instead of negotiating, Hoover ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear them out. The army used tanks, bayonets, and tear gas against their own veterans, burning their camps to the ground. The image of the U.S. Army attacking poor, unarmed men who had fought for their country was a public relations nightmare. It was the final nail in the coffin for his presidency, making him look heartless and cruel to the very people he should have protected. 32. Richard Nixon and the tapes. Richard Nixon was a brilliant political operator, but his paranoia was his ultimate downfall. He was so obsessed with his enemies that he installed a secret voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office to record every conversation. When the Watergate scandal broke, Nixon denied everything, famously declaring, "I am not a crook." However, the Supreme Court eventually forced him to release the tapes, which contained the smoking gun proving he knew about the cover-up and tried to stop the FBI investigation. He had essentially framed himself. If he had just not recorded his own crimes, he might have survived. It is the ultimate irony that the tool he used to spy on others became the very thing that destroyed his career. 33. Gerald Ford and the Stairs. Gerald Ford was actually a star football player at the University of Michigan, which makes his legacy as the clumsy president incredibly ironic. In 1975, upon arriving in Austria, the rain-slicked stairs of Air Force One proved to be his greatest nemesis. As he descended, his knee gave out, and he tumbled down the steps in a moment of ungraceful chaos that was captured by every camera crew present. That single slip turned him into a national punchline. It launched the career of Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live, who spent years falling over furniture just to mock the president. No matter what policies he passed or decisions he made, Ford will forever be remembered as the guy who lost a fight with a staircase in front of the entire world. We just covered 33 absolute disasters, but let's be honest, we barely scratched the surface of political incompetence. American history is loaded with embarrassing moments that did not make the cut today. So I am challenging you. What is the single biggest, dumbest presidential fail that we missed? Who is the one idiot we forgot to roast? Go down to the comments and expose them right now. Like and subscribe if you enjoy watching powerful people fail.